All right, everyone, let's take a look at a list of some easy to build rare champions in Raid Shadow Legends, and the list of rare champions that I selected for today are all going to be farmable in the campaign, which means not only are they going to be easier in order to build, but you can also spend energy to get duplicates of them, which means you can max out their skills without having to use skill books. So you have that as an alternative available to you as well. Now, with that being said, let's jump right to the campaign and talk about a rare champion that I have not actually talked about before, and it is going to be a fantastic rare support champion. Really surprised that she wasn't mentioned in any of my other videos talking about all the great rares in Raid Shadow Legends, and that is going to be a rare farmable in the Durham Forest. Of course, it's going to be Spirit Host. Now, Spirit Host is an absolutely fantastic rare support champion. Let's take a look at her skills. You have Reap, which is going to be attacks one enemy, heals by 50% of the damage inflicted. Now, when it comes to the auto attack skills, I always like to say, as a baseline, anything better than attacks one enemy one time is just going to be an added bonus. So for this skill, you do have attacks one enemy one time, but you also have heals by 50% of the damage inflicted, a little bit of extra added utility and support on top of it. Now, when you see the second and third skills of Spirit Host, you'll see that she's not really going to be an attack or damage-based champion. She's going to be a support. So you don't necessarily need to end up building her with a lot of attack or damage. In fact, you're going to kind of want to go the opposite route. You're going to want her to be survivable. You want her to live as long as possible in battles so that she's constantly providing your team with all the different support, buffs, and utility that she has to offer. So definitely going to want things like HP, defense, maybe even throw a lifesteal set on her or something like that. Attack is definitely not going to be the main priority for Spirit Host. Now, the second skill is going to be Strengthen. It places a 25% increased attack buff on all allies for 2 turns. And then you have the Ascended version of it. And again, because she is a rare, getting to 3-star Ascension should really not be too difficult, and it's going to tremendously increase the power of the skill. Now it places a 50% increased attack buff on all allies for 2 turns. And starts off at a 4-turn cooldown, but with either a skill book or, once again, a duplicate of her, which you can just spend energy to farm her in the campaign, you can lower this down to a 3-turn cooldown. So a really good buff skill on a farmable campaign rare. It's the stronger version of increased attack, and it is for all allies. Definitely not a bad skill. Then you have her third skill, Dark Gift, which is going to remove all debuffs on all allies, places a block debuffs buff on all allies for 1 turn, 6-turn cooldown by default, but once again, you can lower it down to a 5-turn cooldown. Really good utility skill. The combination of her increased attack buff and this utility skill is going to make her a really solid support type champion, especially considering that she is a farmable rare. You don't have to spam ancient shards or do anything too crazy in order to get her. All you have to do is stick to farming the Durham Forest, which you'll also end up getting critical rate gear while doing so. Get lucky, probably takes an average of about 100 to 200 runs, and that will get you a copy of Spirit Host. Also, her fourth skill is going to be a Speed Aura. It's not the strongest, of course, but it is still a Speed Aura, which is going to be the king of all stats. If you don't have a Speed Aura champion, it's going to still be probably the best aura that you have available to you, at least until you get maybe a better Speed Aura champion. Very good, very useful. Overall, Spirit Host is definitely going to be a very solid choice for one of your first support type champions to build and take to level 60. Considering she's farmable in the campaign, really good option available to you. So that's going to be number 1. Now, as we move on to number 2, we are going to head over to the Palace of Aravia. And I did talk about this champion in a couple of my other videos. I think at least one of them, at least briefly, and that is going to be Heiress Iris. I apologize if I mispronounced her name. Definitely pronunciations are not my strong point. Let's not even talk about the big Un incident, because I know that drove some of you guys crazy, and I apologize for that. But Heiress is definitely going to be a pretty darn good choice for a champion to end up building. Not only is she farmable in the campaign, but she is going to be in the probably the best stage of the campaign when it comes to gear drops as well, because stage 6 is going to have all of your speed gear available to you, speed being the king of all stats. I like to use one of these phrases. I've used it in many of my other videos before. You know, you're going to be able to knock out 2 birds with 1 stone. Not only are you going to be able to farm for this champion, but you'll also be able to farm for some early to mid game speed gear as well if you don't really have a whole bunch of it. You can get her to drop in any of the campaign stages, which means you can kind of pick and choose which campaign stages you need the speed gear from. And if you get lucky, once again, about 100 to 200 or so runs will get you a copy of her, and she has some pretty solid skills. Her first skill is really good if you can end up getting the right set of gear to build for it. You're going to need 100% crit rate for this skill though. Bullseye attacks one enemy, grants an extra turn if the target is killed. Now this is very similar to Relic Keeper's auto attack skill, and this skill gains a whole bunch of benefit if you have 100% crit rate, because crit rate is going to end up giving you a whole bunch of extra damage. It's going to be the easiest way to scale damage on a champion. It might be tempting to just get a whole bunch of attack on gear. It's not the worst option, but you're going to realize that if you can end up getting 100% crit rate and then extra crit damage, you're going to increase your damage even more significantly than just massively piling on something like attack. So feel free to, if you're a newer or mid-game player, you can use crit rate sets on her. That's totally fine, but you really want to just build her to have as much damage as possible so that you end up getting as much benefit from this auto attack as you can. Because if you can end up killing targets, granting that extra turn is going to prevent your enemies from taking turns, which is not only going to save you time when it comes to things like farming the campaign or whatever you're doing, but it's also going to give you survivability because you block them from actually doing damage to your team. So very solid auto attack skill. Skill number 2. Removes 1 random debuff from all allies, has a 60% chance of placing a 15% increased speed buff on all allies for 2 turns, and the Ascended version increases it to a 30% increased speed buff. Very, very solid skill. I actually am surprised they kind of overlooked how good this skill is. Removes the debuff is always nice, but also it's a little interesting how it's a 60% chance of placing a 30% increased speed buff, but if you do have skill books or if you do get multiple copies of her, which again you can just end up farming the campaign for, you don't have to use skill books if you don't want to, it does buff it to 100% chance, so that's pretty nice. Avenger counterattacks the attacker when an ally is attacked. This is a pretty solid passive skill, and she also has increases ally speed in dungeons by 16%. So very solid campaign farmable rare, especially if you have the right type of gear and the damage in order to get the full benefit from this bullseye skill. That in combination with being able to get speed gear while farming for her at the same time, definitely not a bad choice. Now we're going to move on to Stage 9, the Deadlands, and I'm going to actually talk about both champions here, but we're going to talk about Wardmaiden first, because this is another champion that I haven't really talked too much about, and while she might not be the absolute strongest rare, she's definitely not a bad campaign farmable rare. Definitely going to be useful if you are a newer player. She has a pretty solid skill kit. You have Ferocious Attack, attacks one enemy, has a 30% chance of placing a 2.5% poison debuff for 1 turn. So once again, anything better than just attacks one enemy 1 time is going to be an added bonus when it comes to the auto attack. So having that extra poison is pretty nice, even though it isn't a very high chance of applying it. Even though it is a weaker poison, it is still just an added bonus on top of what would normally just be the default auto attack, attacks one enemy 1 time. Second skill is going to be attacks one enemy, places a 50% increased attack buff on this champion, and places an extra hit if this attack is critical. The extra hit cannot be critical. So again, one of those skills where the more crit you have, the more the skill is going to benefit. Not only is crit going to increase the damage, but you have a component of the skill that actually directly benefits from having more crit as well. So crit is definitely going to be one of the strongest stats in Raid Shadow Legends, probably right behind speed, I would say. Some people might argue accuracy, but accuracy is a whole different discussion. Very, very important for a lot of skills. So once again, if you can end up building a decent amount of crit rate and crit damage, Wardmaiden is going to be an attack-based champion, so anything along those lines is going to end up making her stronger. And finally, her third skill, Crumbling Blast, attacks all enemies, has a 75% chance of placing a 30% decreased defense debuff for 2 turns, and it's going to be increased to a 60% decreased defense debuff for 2 turns if you ascend it to 3 stars. There's your AoE, and it also has an added strong version of the debuff as well. Can be lowered to 3 turns. The damage is increased, the debuff chance is increased as well with skill books or extra copies of her. Very, very solid third skill. So overall, Wardmaiden not going to be the absolute best rare, but for a farmable campaign rare that is strictly an offensive type champion with some extra added debuffs and buffs, definitely not a bad choice at all. Now, I threw in Berserker because out of the 5 champions that I'm going to talk about in this list, he's probably going to be the weakest, but because he is also farmable in the same stage as Wardmaiden, I thought that I would throw him in because, once again, you can knock out 2 birds with 1 stone, and he's not terrible. He's, again, probably the weakest out of the 5 that I'm going to talk about, but he's still a decent attack-based type champion. So you have his first skill, attacks one enemy, fills the champion's turn meter by 30% if this attack is critical. Once again, you can see why crit rate is just a phenomenal stat in Raid Shadow Legends. Not only is it going to give him more damage, but this skill is once again directly influenced by crit rate. So it's going to fill his turn meter, and turn meter fill is very, very strong because you always want to be taking more turns in comparison to the turns that your enemies are taking. Second skill, attacks one enemy, grants an extra turn if the target is killed. Another one of those skills where if you have more damage and you're hitting harder, you're going to benefit more from it directly by granting an extra turn. And finally, you have his AoE skill, attacks all enemies 2 times, and it ignores 20% of the target's defense if you have it ascended. This is simply going to just mean that it's going to do more damage, and getting to 3-star ascension really shouldn't be too difficult. So definitely a pretty solid attack-based champion. Not the absolute best, but he's definitely going to be better than the average rare, I would say, especially considering you can fill his turn meter with his auto attack. He has an extra turn from this skill right here, and his AoE hits a little bit harder than the average AoE if you have it ascended because it ignores some of the defense. So throwing it in there with Wardmaiden because he is from the same stage. Now we're going to end up moving on to Chapter 11, the Hallowed Halls, for the 5th and final campaign farmable rare that I want to talk about in this video. That doesn't mean that it's the only other good one. It's just that, first of all, I could only really fit 5 champions in this video, and second of all, usually the other farmable campaign rares are a bit more situational. So I wanted to talk about these ones because you're going to be able to use them in the most places as a newer player. And that is, of course, going to end up being Executioner. Executioner is a really, really good, one of the first, how do I say this? But it's a good first kind of rare to end up taking to 60 because he's going to have a lot of situations where he's going to come in handy. I see a lot of newer players take Executioner to level 60 and 6-star him and have no regrets. He can definitely have lots of uses, especially with his counterattack skill, but he also has some extra stuff that he adds to the table as well. Now, he is a defense-based champion, but his skill, this skill right here, is based on attack. So thought that I would mention that because it's a little bit easy to get confused. Even though it says, like, if you look under the rarity defense, still make sure you actually take a look at the individual skills because sometimes it can vary. I think it's a little bit confusing as well, but that's just kind of the way that it works. So he is a defensive-based champion, but his auto attack skill is still going to scale off of attack. Attacks one enemy, has a 15% chance of placing a stun debuff for 1 turn. This is, you know, again, anything better than attacks one enemy 1 time is just an added bonus, so having that stun is nice to have. Second skill is going to be an AoE, attacks all enemies, decreases the turn meter by 20%, has a 50% chance of placing a decreased speed debuff for 2 turns. And you can actually increase the debuff chance. You can lower this cooldown down to 3 turns. Pretty solid second skill. Decreasing the turn meter as well is going to come in handy in many situations. That's a very, very strong component to have in a skill. Pretty solid AoE overall. And this one is actually based off of not just attack, but it's going to be based off of both attack and defense. So definitely always when you look at the skills, look at this damage based off of thing right here to kind of see what the skills are going to be based off of. Then you have his third skill, which is going to be his counterattack. And you have places a 30% increased defense buff and a counterattack buff on this champion for 3 turns. And if you ascend him to 3 stars, places a 60% increased defense debuff and a counterattack buff on this champion for 3 turns. Now, 7-turn cooldown, yes, but he has a double cooldown reduction from increasing his skills. So you can actually lower this down to a 5-turn cooldown. The counterattack as well lasts for 3 turns, and you get the stronger version of the increased defense buff as well. So you can see for a newer player, having this very strong counterattack buff utility type skill on a farmable rare champion going to come in handy in many applications in Raid Shadow Legends. So Executioner definitely has a pretty solid kit for a farmable rare champion in the campaign. He also has an increased allied defense in all battles, which is nice, and the fact that he is in stage 11 is another really big bonus, because even though this gear set is not necessarily super strong, you're going to be getting good experience per energy spent here. Generally speaking, when it comes to the campaign stages, you want to stick to farming the later stages more because they end up giving you more efficiency for your energy. So the fact that you can also end up farming for this champion while still end up getting really good experience and silver from the campaign stages is just another added little bonus. So once again, being able to knock out 2 birds with 1 stone is always something that you want to end up aiming for when it comes to efficiency in Raid Shadow Legends. So like I said, there are plenty of other decent champions that you can farm in the campaign, but I wanted to go over these 5 because these ones are going to have the most applications in the most areas in the game for newer players. The other ones are going to be a bit more situational, so I didn't want to talk about them as some of your first champions to bring to level 60, because some of the first champions that you want to bring to level 60 in Raid Shadow Legends, you don't want them to be situational. You want them to be able to be used in as many aspects of the game as possible, and then once you kind of develop your roster a little bit more, then you can start building champions to 60 that are a lot more specific. So the other champions, they're not bad or anything, they're just more specific, so that's why I went through this list of 5 right here. But these are going to be some fantastic choices for farmable, easier to build rare champions in the campaign. So as a newer player, I'm really hoping that you guys ended up enjoying this video and that it did help out. So if you guys enjoyed this video and you want more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing to the channel. Really appreciate the support, everyone. We are at about 20,500 subscribers, so thank you once again, everyone. If you guys enjoyed and you want to help support, taking a quick quarter of a second or so to like the video means a whole lot. So thank you to all of you guys who do that. And if you're interested in more videos, guides, tutorials, and stuff like this about Raid Shadow Legends, they should be popping up on the screen right about now. So feel free to check them out. Tons of videos on the channel to help you out. But if not, have a fantastic day, everyone. Take care, and until next time, this is Salt of the Salty Guild, signing out.